in the School of Natural Resources. So we'll get right into it. So just some general information if this is your first time joining us for these regular webinars that we have. This is a collaborative activity among different agencies within NOAA, including National Centers for Environmental Information, National Weather Service, Office of Atmospheric Research, NIDIS, National Integrated Drought Information System, the Climate Hubs from the USDA, American Association of State Climatologists. Often it's my colleagues around the middle part of the country that provide these webinars. We're supported a lot by the Midwestern and the High Plains Regional Climate Centers. So some of the graphics that you'll see come from those centers, as well as the National Drought Mitigation Center. These webinars are held every month, the third Thursday of each month. So the next one coming up is August 20th, and that will be provided by Dr. Stuart Foster. He's the state climatologist for Kentucky. You can access this webinar as well as future or past webinars at the following website. So there's a number of places you can go to access these webinars. And as Doug mentioned, it will be open for questions at the end. If you have some that come to mind that you don't want to lose, please type them into the chat box. For today's webinar, I'm going to provide a recap of the climate conditions, look at 2020 year to date, look at June and kind of the recent history. Looking at some of the impacts, we've got a lot to talk about throughout the region, a lot of interesting things going on, from too little water to too much water in certain areas, increasing dryness taking place for a good part of the region as well. We'll also look at an outlook, and kind of a highlight there is excessive heat in the near term, looking at this weekend and kind of the rest of July, looking at those chances for heat impacts coming up. So just some images that are kind of contrasting around the region here. We've got stressed corn as seen in Iowa, courtesy of Iowa State University, Megan Anderson. And then out of Illinois, where a lot of people have gotten pretty heavy rain in the recent past, and in a very short amount of time. This was sent to me by the Illinois state climatologist. Photos courtesy of Miles Chiotti. 4 to 7 inches of rain in a period of 4 hours in a swath of central Illinois. So it's just kind of showing some dynamics going on around the region. All right, so first a recap of 2020, where we've been so far in the first 6 months of the year. On the left, you can see statewide average temperature rankings for much of the region. We're in that above to much above normal category for that 6-month time period. So that's averaging out a lot of the highs and lows, but for on a 6-month basis, that's where we've ended up. In that much above category would be Colorado, Michigan, and Ohio, kind of ranking in that top 10 to top 15 warmest first 6 months of the year on record. The other states in the region are again in that above average category. For statewide precipitation, we see differences across the region. And again, this is an average statewide ranking, so it might be a bit different at your specific location, but on a statewide average basis, we're looking at dryness in kind of the north and west, where North Dakota, 6th driest on record in that much below average category. Colorado, 8th driest, starting to see some significant impacts of that dryness and drought increasing, particularly in Colorado. And then the kind of the central part of the region, we're in that below average category. Whereas if you go to the eastern part of the central US into Wisconsin and Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky in particular, they're in kind of a top 10 wettest for the first 6 months of the year. So differences across the region here for precipitation conditions. We'll narrow in on the time frame here. We'll look at how June ended up. And so June statewide average temperature rankings, we're in that much above normal category, which was a pretty rapid switch from what happened in May. May was generally cool around the region, and then it was like a flip was switched when we entered June, and it was really warm the first few weeks and quite windy. Nebraska it was anyway. So much above normal for the month of June, again, for that central portion of the region, and most states were in that above average category, aside from Kentucky, which was in the near average category. And I wanted to highlight in particular, on the right, you'll see the nighttime lows. This is on a county level basis. It doesn't show up quite as well on a statewide average basis, where we have these really high nighttime minimum temperatures. And in Nebraska, there were some records set. Omaha had a record high one day of 77 degrees. And this can certainly be where you start to see some impacts, where if we don't cool down appreciably at night, then we can start to have human impacts, animal impacts, impacts to agriculture, and that nighttime respiration for those crops and plants. So record warmest for minimum temperatures for portions of Nebraska, Iowa, and eastern South Dakota. And for those of you that live in that kind of central part of the region in particular, it's very, very humid, really humid days and nights there in June. For precipitation, I'm not showing the statewide average ranking because you can see for Iowa, for example, there's differences. It might average to be near normal, but that doesn't really tell the picture. So I think looking at the county level is a bit better here. So you can see kind of a mix of conditions where certain areas were wet, say in northeast Iowa, versus dry in west central and southwest Iowa. So there's a real mix of conditions even within the state level. Generally, it's a bit dry overall. If you look at the kind of the bigger picture in June, central Nebraska, southeast Kansas, southern North Dakota, portions of Illinois and Indiana, west portions of Missouri, parts of Ohio, parts of Michigan. So there's areas in the region that are getting rather dry here in June. For some states, this should be the time of year where they get their highest precipitation on average. And so you can see kind of how this month played out. All right, so I'm going to kind of come close to where we are now and look at 30-day precipitation departure from normal. And it kind of tells a similar picture here in terms of kind of spotty areas of precipitation versus areas of dryness. And I'm going to step back in time here. So we'll go 30 days, then 60 days, in the past 90 days. And we'll see kind of how this dryness is developing, and then the areas that have received some fairly significant precipitation amounts. We've had some severe weather, kind of isolated, kind of hit and miss storms throughout the region that have resulted in some pretty significant rainfall totals. So in terms of a departure from normal precipitation, that's on the scale that you're seeing here. So you can see, again, mixed areas where in the green it's above normal the past 30 days, Wisconsin, portions of western Kansas, areas of South Dakota, northwest Minnesota, and northeast North Dakota, portions of Montana, kind of in if you look to the east of the region, southern Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky. So some areas have gotten a fair amount of precipitation in the last 30 days, whereas others are remaining quite dry. In southern Missouri and west central Iowa, you can see some 3 to 4 inch precipitation deficits. And I'll step back in time, and you can see kind of those areas of dryness kind of strengthen here. If we go back 60 days, that's what the conditions look like. And then 90 days. And so where these strongest departures are for the past 90 days, you can see parts of Minnesota and then parts of western Iowa are approaching 8 inches departure from normal. Eastern Nebraska, the Nebraska Panhandle, parts of eastern Wyoming, southwest South Dakota, and then if we look over to the east, Indiana and Ohio. So again, this dryness has kind of amplified over time, and the dryness is certainly welcome when you're trying to get into the ground and get equipment in the field and plant. Then you do want those windows where it is dry and you can get equipment in. But later in the summer, when these crops are growing and you do want that rainfall, that's where some areas certainly have missed out. So having seen kind of that view of the last 30, 60, 90 days, so here to compare to the previous slide, we're looking at a 3-month change in the U.S. Drought Monitor. We're looking at 1, 2, and 3 class degradations primarily over the over the region as a whole. Only a few areas have improved in class. South central Nebraska, north central Kansas, portions of Montana, small portion of Minnesota. Some areas have seen improvement, but largely we've seen this ramping up of these dryness conditions and introduction of abnormally dry and then these drought categories. And I'll show the U.S. drought monitor map in just a bit. But this gives you a look over the last 3 months, how we've changed. All right, so let's zero in just specifically on a 30-day temperature. We'll look at temperature departure from normal and then precipitation departure from normal. And what we've seen for kind of the central part of this region is continued warmth, continued warmer than normal temperatures. And if you look at these departures for that orange color, we're kind of in the greater than 2 to 4 degrees warmer than normal for those parts. And that's again on average over the past 30 days. And then kind of on the fringes in western Wyoming into Montana, and then on the eastern side of the region into Kentucky and areas southward where it's been cooler than normal, again on average for the past 30 days. We'll look at precipitation, and I apologize. It looks like I did not for this one. I didn't grab the one from yesterday, which will bump those totals up a bit more. But again, you can see kind of the somewhat isolated nature of the precipitation. It's generally favoring the eastern part, portions of the eastern part of the region into Kentucky, parts of Illinois, eastern part of Iowa into Wisconsin, southern Minnesota, northwestern Minnesota, and northeastern North Dakota, and then portions of South Dakota. And then we've got a small blip kind of in southeast Nebraska and central Kansas. And when we're looking at stream flows, you can see that that's reflective of the precipitation that has tended to hit these areas, whereas it's pretty dry in the western part of the region. You can see Wyoming and Colorado. We're looking at much less precipitation received, and then into Iowa, the western half of Iowa and into Missouri. It has been missing out recently on those precipitation events, leading to impacts, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so the latest U.S. drought monitor, so this was published today, and it's reflective of conditions as of Tuesday, so it does not take into account precipitation that was received in the past couple days. So as of Tuesday, here are the conditions. So a little bit more than half of the central part of the U.S. is now in the D0, which is abnormally dry, to D4 categories. So the D3 is actually as most severe as we go. We see some of that in Colorado and then far southwest Kansas. We do have some pockets of severe drought, or D2, in Wyoming, in Minnesota, northeast Minnesota, and also recently shown up in western Iowa, as well as Montana. So these areas again are seeing these stronger deficits in precipitation totals. So in terms of drought, that's where we are now. Okay, let's look at soil moisture conditions. These images are modeled soil moisture, and it's meant to give you a kind of a broader scale view as opposed to localized conditions. Those are going to vary. They can vary significantly depending on where you are in your soil type and drainage patterns and slope and things like that. So there can be a lot of nuances to these, but it's reflective of the overall conditions of, say, a basin scale. The June conditions, the one on the left there, that shows you the calculated soil moisture ranking percentiles. So again, you can see that the areas that have missed out on those on precipitation: southern half of Wyoming into Colorado, portions of southwest Nebraska, and into western Kansas. We're on the low end of these percentiles. So in terms of the historical record, majority of the soil moisture rankings are above this category. So it sits on the lower end of these soil moisture totals. Whereas areas in South Dakota, you can see where it's kind of hanging on to the wetness, southern Minnesota into Wisconsin, portions of Illinois, and then parts southward are kind of on that high end of the percentile ranking. So most of the observations are going to be below the values for June. And on the right, we're looking at kind of a snapshot. This is for July 11th. And when we look at these short-term soil moisture conditions, those can vary more quickly because we're looking at more at individual precipitation events or individual storms. So you can see those percentile rankings are a bit stronger than what we see on a monthly basis. But as of a few days ago, this was the soil moisture ranking conditions. So for about middle of July, this is where we sit now. Okay, so another way to look at soil moisture is a product by the USDA, and special thanks to Brad Rippey for these and other maps that I'll be showing from USDA. And there are maps that look at topsoil moisture as well as deeper moisture. And what I'm going to be showing is topsoil moisture, and that's so kind of in the top 6 inches, kind of the root zone. We see that conditions are worsening for many states. And again, this is kind of a statewide perspective. So kind of this regional look. And again, this might not be reflective of what your local conditions are like. So we see kind of a recent drying out and a lot of crops utilizing this water. We've seen warmer than normal temperatures for the most part. We've seen high evapotranspiration rates, and so a lot of need for the moisture that's in the soil by these growing crops or pasture and rangeland and so forth. I don't show the subsoil, but that is also showing declines as well. So the moisture that's in that full soil profile, that's being utilized up. Luckily, to start the 2020 growing season, we did. 2019 was one of the wettest years on record. I know Nebraska was 3rd wettest on record. So there's quite a bit in reserve to start the season, which is helpful to get those crops kind of a kickstart. Okay. So here we're looking at river flows, and so this is kind of a snapshot. And in general, across the region, we're seeing localized declines, especially in the West, where they haven't had and benefited from precipitation. Parts of north central Minnesota, portions of Iowa and northern Missouri, Republican River in Nebraska. So some of these river flows are lower and in that lower percentile. So in the orange and reddish color, that's in the kind of 25% and lower percentile ranking category, whereas the areas that it has been wet in the eastern Dakotas, you can see the James River there in eastern South Dakota, areas of Wisconsin, you see some blue dots and black is the highest stream flow for that particular gauging station. The blue would be a 90th percentile category, so we are still seeing some wetness and reflections of that in the hydrologic system across the region. So in terms of flooding, this was certainly the big thing to talk about last year, but not so much where we are now. Everything is melted in the mountains. We're past kind of the springtime snowmelt runoff, and if you look at the flood projections, say from the flood center here, the only thing really to highlight is the James River in South Dakota, which it has been wet for quite a long time. So that's really the only thing that's kind of popping up in terms of the region as a whole, in terms of a long-range flood risk going forward. And I believe, see, Doug and I were just talking before the webinar, I believe 469 days portions of the James River has been at or above flood stage. So this is a long-term issue that has been going on since we are coming off such a wet year last year. So keeping on the theme of hydrology in the Great Lakes. So the two big things to talk about in the Great Lakes are it's pretty warm and the lake levels are pretty high. So here we're looking at kind of a nice seasonal curve of Lake Michigan. This is an average surface water temperature 2020 compared to the period 1992 to 2019. So the historical period, that's in the blue smoothed curve, and 2020, these are surface water temperatures compared to that, that historical record. So you can see we're trending about 4 to some about 8 degrees warmer than normal. So very warm water temperatures, as well as very high lake levels, which is impacting shorelines and construction and the area around these lakes because the levels are so high and have been high. So we're seeing some impacts in regard to these high lake levels. And on the next slide here, I'll show some images from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and they have all of the lake level data available. I'm just showing a few of the lakes here. So we're looking at 2020 in the red curve. This is on a monthly basis. So 2020 is the red curve. 2019 is in blue. So for a period of years here, we've been at these high lake levels. So this is not necessarily a new story going on, but it's an ongoing anomalous situation here. And you can see even for Lake Michigan and Huron, the black dashes for each month, those are the record high and low. So you can see where 2020 is hitting and compared to 2019. So here we're actually surpassing the record high for Lake Michigan and Huron. And again, there are other data available for the other lakes on the Army Corps of Engineers website. Okay, get into some severe weather issues. And in general, we kind of started out relatively slow start to the severe weather year. A lot of places, a lot of states are reporting not a whole lot going on in June. So we're trending lower than average. Here I'm just showing tornadoes that have been reported. This is the Severe Storm Center. There's been only one in both Illinois and Iowa, which is much lower than average. I think for Illinois, the average is about 11 for the month of June. And so we're really trending down for June in terms of tornadoes. But another thing to note is July 8th, we had a tornado outbreak in Minnesota as the first EF4 tornado in Minnesota in a decade. So a very severe and very strong tornado observed in Minnesota. So we're not without severe weather, but it did seem to get a slow start this year. So keeping on the same theme of severe weather, an event to point out in Nebraska on the 8th of July, and also impacted portions of Minnesota as well. We had some very high wind gusts observed, and in this Storm Prediction Center storm report image that you see in the top right, the red is tornado, the blue is wind reports, and then the green are hail reports. And it's important to note that there were some observing stations in Nebraska that had wind gusts over 90 miles per hour, several over 80 miles per hour. Significant impacts to corn were reported in south central part of Nebraska. Here's an image that you see of corn that is what's called green snap, and so these stalks essentially just snap over. I don't believe there's not much recovery that can take place when a green snap happens. Again, this image photo courtesy of Jenny Reese with Nebraska Extension. There are other things that can happen to corn. That's not the only thing. There can be lodging, and there there can be impacts that are recoverable to these high wind events, but green snap is one that is certainly difficult in terms of recovery. There was also severe weather July 11th, high wind and hail impacting crops in Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. So there certainly have been within the last month, 30 days, some severe weather activity kind of isolated throughout the region that has impacted crops such as what you see here. We'll look at agricultural conditions, and I'm going to start with pasture and range conditions. And the image that you see here is looking at about the last 10 years. So each color line on there is a different year, and 2020 is in bright red there. And it's important to note, I think, that the overall condition for the U.S. as a whole is worst since 2012. So the conditions were worst in the warm and dry year of 2012. But in terms of how we're trending thus far in the season, the overall condition is kind of tanking. We're having hot conditions, dry conditions, and the state of pasture and range is certainly responding to that. And the next image here, I will show kind of a state-by-state basis. A lot of this US total is being driven by what's going on in the western portion of the region, say in Wyoming and Colorado. So what you're seeing here is the percent of pasture and range that is rated in the good to excellent category. So you can see that these lower numbers occur for the west. We've got less than half of pasture and range are in that good to excellent condition, kind of the central part of the region. So declining conditions for pasture and range. And now we'll flip to some other crops of interest. So again, these are courtesy of USDA and Brad Rippey. So spring wheat conditions, we're looking at percent good to excellent. So it's more than 50% kind of in the Dakotas, Minnesota, and Montana. We're looking at 60% or greater in that good to excellent category. The change from last week for those states as a whole was -2, so we got a little bit worse in terms of the condition that's rated good to excellent. In terms of soybeans, you can see across the region how the ranking is in that good to excellent category. That's in the 70s, high 60s, 70s in the western part of the region, in Nebraska and South Dakota. It's fairly good. Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin. Then we start getting to about 60% or so of soybean production is in that good to excellent category. And then finally, we'll look at corn here. And it's faring a bit better kind of in the central part of the region. So in Minnesota, we're looking at 85% in the good to excellent category, no change from last week. Again, that's that bottom number. 83% in Iowa, a little bit of a decline from last week. 70% in Nebraska, again, decline from last week, holding steady for the statewide average in South Dakota at 82%, 70% in North Dakota, a bit of a decline. Wisconsin, they're at 81% and an increase from last week. And it's a bit lower percentages. Colorado, Kansas, we're looking at 40 to 50% in the good to excellent category. And then further east, we're in the 60 to 70% category. Or Ohio is one of the lower ones at 47% ranked good to excellent. And again, a decline from last week. In preparing for this webinar, we asked for input from local folks and people from the different states in the region, and a common theme that kept coming up was kind of that bullseye in the western half of Iowa. So we're starting to see some impacts the pineapple corn, you know, those are, it's not the Dole plantation, that's Iowa, and the corn shouldn't look like that right now. Brown lawns, these come from Craig Coggill, who's a forecaster with the National Weather Service office. So impacts that we're seeing in Iowa, you can think about other dry areas of the region, starting to see these impacts to crops as well. Okay. One thing to look out for here is in the near term, what's coming up here over the next week to 2 weeks. And one thing that we're keeping an eye on pretty closely is this risk of excessive heat. In addition, there's also a heavy rain risk as well for portions of Nebraska and southwest South Dakota, parts of Iowa, into northern Missouri and northwest Illinois and Wisconsin. That's why you see the flooding possible there for kind of the central part of the region. So we're keeping a close eye on this risk of excessive heat. And the image that you see there, that's something that it is a way that we can be impacted by these significant heat events. So highway buckling due to heat. That image is from the Illinois DOT, came to us from Trenton Ford. So we're keeping a close eye on this event and what the impacts will be. And if we go out a little bit further, again, looking at excessive heat, that's high temperatures, high nighttime temperatures, high dew points, that we're in the moderate to slight risk for excessive heat. And this is going out a little bit further in the into next week. So the third and final week of July.
And Martha, just to add a, sorry, there's always a question on what does that mean? What does excessive heat mean? And I'm not going to give you I'm not going to give everybody an exact answer, but what it means generally, and it's relative to where you live and where you are. So excessive heat in North Dakota is different than excessive heat in Texas. In other words, it's not the same temperature. And it is a combination, as Martha just said, of actual temperature and the amount of humidity in the air. So we call those heat indices, or practical heat or whatever. We say it's above the 85 percentile. So only 15% of the time is it that hot. And the other piece of this is, yeah, it's going to get super hot during the middle of the day, 95, let's say, 100 in some places. And the indices will, like I said, 100 to 115 in some places. It's the nighttime temperatures too that aren't as obvious here, that have a lot of impacts in terms of not being able to cool down both animals and humans, and crops for that matter. Crops breathe like we do in many ways. So sorry, Martha, just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, that's okay. I think something was brought up yesterday in preparing for this, where Chicago might have 105 heat index, or the feels like temperature. So those are the kinds of values that we're talking about. But it's good to point out that it is respective of where you are. So continuing on to the heat impacts, primarily throughout the region, the corn is reaching the pollination or tasseling phase right now. And so what you don't want is high nighttime temperatures and high dew points, which keep those nighttime temperatures high, and high daytime temperatures. So so it remains to be seen the level of impact and the scale of impact to corn production, but the upcoming excessive heat for these different areas is coming at a time of year where it's not desirable at all in terms of corn production. So if you're in the tasseling phase right now, this is not what we want to have happen. So harmful to grain fill, which leading to reduced or lost yields potentially. So it will be interesting coming out of the event, kind of how these crops are impacted. But across the region, this certainly will be an issue to watch. Okay, so for the hazards I mentioned, kind of an outlook, kind of an upcoming event that we're keeping an eye on. So I'll transition to kind of the outlook section of the webinar here. So we'll look at precipitation first, and this is from the quantitative precipitation forecast. And this is the total for the next 7 days. So tomorrow through the next 7 days, what does our precipitation chances look like? And what you're seeing here is that eastern portions of the region and isolated areas in the west, such as Southwest South Dakota, Northeast Wyoming, and southern portions of Colorado, they will likely see the greatest amounts. And certainly the amount that you know, this is just guidance, and so the amount that you would receive in a particular area could be more variable than what's in this image. So in thinking about where there are precipitation deficits and where we need to make up some ground, the kind of the bullseye that we have in the southern half of Iowa, if that were targeting the western half, that would be most desirable. So some of these areas that are in significant precipitation deficits might be making up some ground, although these totals are in the 1.5 to 2.5 inches range. So it might not make up everything that we need, but we might see some relief in some areas. Okay, so that was precipitation. Here we'll look at ENSO status, El Nino Southern Oscillation. And so within the past week, NOAA has put us in a La Nina watch. And so it doesn't mean that we're currently in an El Nino, but the probability, so the likelihood of shifting from neutral to La Nina, that is what's favored. So La Nina in this image on these 3-month seasonal basis, La Nina is in blue. So you can see when it goes over the 50% probability, so that's the one category that is favored. So we're not in a La Nina currently, we're just in a watch, and that the potential is there. We're seeing signatures in the ocean and in the atmosphere that would lead us to say that the highest probability for the winter season would be La Nina. The 8 to 14 day temperature and precipitation outlook. So this came out this morning, and it's valid for the period, kind of the last week in July 23rd to the 29th. And the warm conditions are generally favored for much of the contiguous US. And for this region, the highest probability for those warmer than normal temperatures, most significantly for the southern parts of the region. They're into southern Nebraska and the western 2/3 of Kansas and extreme eastern Colorado. And then precipitation, so along with this warmer than normal conditions, the most likely or the highest probability for Nebraska and areas southward is in the below normal precipitation category. The other parts of the region are in the normal category. We'll go to August. So on the whole, what do we expect August to trend toward in terms of temperature and precipitation? And for a lot of the region in the southern and eastern portions of the region, the above normal temperatures is in the highest category there. So the most likelihood is for the above normal temperatures. There's equal chances of above, near, and below normal for the northern and northwestern portions of this central region. Looking at precipitation, there's kind of this wet signal that's for the north central part of the US here in eastern Montana, northeastern Wyoming, kind of grazes into Nebraska, the Dakotas, and the western half of Minnesota. And there's also a tendency or a favoring of wetter than normal conditions for far southeast Illinois, southern half of Indiana, and the southern half of Ohio, and all of Kentucky. Kentucky has been wet for quite a while. So these areas are where wetness is continued to favor. Other portions are in the equal chances category. Again, that's equal chances of above, near, or below normal. And in the far southern portion of southeast Colorado and southern Kansas, where they are in that below normal precipitation probability. And we'll look at August, September, October for that 3-month time period. Pretty warm signal for the US, and actually including Alaska there. So that tendency to remain in that above normal category is in place. The precipitation conditions there on the right, again, the kind of the wet signal in place in the north central US and the southeast US, those kind of remain in place. And then this below normal category for precipitation covers much of Wyoming, Colorado, southwest Nebraska, and western portion of Kansas. So below normal precipitation is favored for the whole 3-month season. And I'll just go into, flip another 3 months forward and go to November, December, January, and you can see the warm signal kind of hanging on, aside from portion of the Dakotas and much of Minnesota. They're in that equal chances category. And for precipitation, again, a continued wet signal in the north central part of the US, and the dry signal in the southern portion, which is kind of indicative of a La Nina to neutral category that we might be in terms of what's going on kind of in the global atmosphere, and how might the jet stream go, how might that weather systems move through during the winter season. That's kind of the signal that's playing out here. All right, just a few more slides to go here. We'll look at the drought outlook. So we're seeing some improvements for the eastern portion of the region. In the northern areas, portions of southwest South Dakota and northeast Wyoming, the Arrowhead region of Minnesota, portions of western Iowa, and some pockets in the eastern part of the region. We're looking at, or the prediction is for a drought removal. Unfortunately, for the western part of the region into Kansas and Nebraska, a persistence of drought or development of drought in the areas that are currently not in drought. So again, this is the seasonal outlook for middle of July to the end of October. And potential for wildfire. This is done on a monthly basis, National Interagency Fire Center. So looking at significant wildland fire potential. You can see where it kind of shifts. You see where it is for July in red, as well as for a portion in northeast Minnesota. And that's kind of shifting a bit northward later on in the year. So into Wyoming, western South Dakota, and southwest North Dakota, where this high above normal potential for significant wildland fires. And then finally, looking at grassland production, I just want to mention this product, GrassCast, in case you're not familiar with it. It takes these seasonal outlooks and relates that to grassland production. Given how the conditions are currently, if the upcoming season is above normal precipitation, normal, or below normal precipitation, what does that mean for grassland production? And you can kind of see the map here, the percent change compared to a historical average about the last 30-year time period. The areas where it has been drier are in that yellow to orange and red category, with reduced production for this year. There's also some areas that are in the increased production for this year. And again, and this assumes normal precipitation. If you want to dig deeper into this, you can go on the website and get a few more maps to look at above normal and below normal if you're interested in a particular part of the region. But just to give you an idea of kind of the Great Plains as a whole, this is grassland production and productivity, assuming a normal precipitation pattern going forward. All right, so to sum up here, some of the key impacts, increasing pattern of dryness across the region, in which half, I think 52% of the central US was in abnormally dry or worse. That's been worsening over time over the last 3 months. We had a relatively slow start to the severe weather season, but it has been picking up lately. Range and pasture conditions, they are showing declines. Corn is generally across the region, seems to be at about pollination. Likely that we could have some impacts with the upcoming heat, humidity, as well as nighttime temperatures. So all that, those combination of factors don't bode well for corn when they're at tasseling phase. Soybeans have not been impacted significantly thus far on a broad scale basis. There are some areas where heat and dryness is impacting them, but it seems to be fairly localized. But if the heat continues, then we might start to see some impacts to soybeans. And certainly with the hazardous and the excessive heat conditions going forward here, especially for this weekend and for the remainder of July, it's important to keep in mind that precautions should be taken for those working outside for livestock in terms of crops and human health. And so it's important to kind of take this seriously and take these precautions into account. And finally, for the outlook, the warm signal, broad scale warm signal that we've seen across the region, that's expected to continue generally above average temperatures for both the monthly and seasonal outlooks. That category is favored going forward. We do see the wetter than normal signal, that tendency is favored in the northern tier of the region, while equal chances kind of in the middle part of the central US, and then dryness has the highest probability in the south and southwestern part of the region. We are now in a La Nina watch. Slight probabilities of La Nina is favored throughout the winter. So it'll be important to keep an eye if in case this were to change or to strengthen. So that's something we'll be keeping a watch on. All right, so just to end up here, so for additional information and some of the graphics and tools that I highlighted here, you can find at the following websites here. And again, a recording of today's and past presentations can be found at the High Plains and the Midwestern Regional Climate Center. The list of kind of climate service organizations are there. And we have a little bit of time for questions, and there's some contact information of those that were involved in developing this presentation. So Doug, I will hand it over to you for question and answer.
Yep. So we're going to speed through these like we usually do. We're at the end of the hour, more or less. So one of the things that kept popping up was we need an explanation of what La Nina is. And so I'm going to do that really quick. La Nina tends to be the opposite sign of what's going on in the equatorial Pacific from El Nino. So there's El Nino and there's La Nina. I'm sure what most people are really interested in is what does that mean? So what, right? It's a big so what. What does that mean in terms of our outlooks? And if Martha would be kind enough to go back to her, I think NDJ or whatever it was, November, December, January map, we can give a slight indication of what a typical sort of neutral to weak, and right now it looks weak if it's going to happen at all. It's not a very good chance. There's not a lot of confidence that it's going to happen yet. As the months sort of, as we get closer and closer to fall, that confidence will go one way, will hopefully go up in terms of what's actually going to happen. But as she shows there, temperatures in the southern part of the U.S. tend to be, and this is a very broad tendency, tend to be above normal, and temperatures as you move north are closer to normal or even below normal as you get a stronger and stronger La Nina event. That's the way it goes in terms of temperatures with a La Nina. So cool north, hot or warmer south, and with precipitation, kind of a similar game here. Drier to the south and wetter to the north, especially in the north central part of the U.S. Again, if the La Nina signature occurs in the Pacific, and we won't go into great explanation of how and why that all happens, but that's why we report what we call ENSO condition is, whether it's El Nino or La Nina or neutral. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Yeah, and just another general question. You can always get a PDF of this presentation. Martha's happy enough to share that with everyone. We'll put those on websites. If you maybe go back to the very end, sorry, or the second to last one, and there's a couple URLs up there separated by a space. If you go to those websites in about 48 hours or so, we'll have the recording of this, and we'll have the PDF files up there to download if you want them. If you need them before that, you can email me, doug.cluck@noaa.gov if you care to, and I will send them to you. Let's see. You mentioned rains. I don't know how quickly we can pull something like this up, but you mentioned rains in one of your maps in the last 2 days, and you weren't able to show those. Or actually, I think you did show those on a couple presentation or a couple of slides. I'll just say again, for lack of time, there was a lot of rain across, or substantial rain across Kansas, northern Kansas, into Missouri, and then on into other parts of the Midwest like Illinois and such. This week, a day or two ago, I guess a day ago, and that's where most of that rain fell in that kind of stripe there. There were rains also around in other places, but I had 3.5 inches, and I'm in Kansas City, so northern Kansas City. So there was substantial rains for a number of folks in that area. Dennis, I know you answered the question, but can corn conditions recover from dryness? We'll just leave it at that. Can you answer that in 2 seconds?
Takes 4 seconds. There has been widespread minor damage to the corn crop already, largely probably the eastern corn belt. That probably won't, it may ding yields a little bit. There are more significant damage being done in isolated spots like that western Iowa area that Martha mentioned. We've probably taken a hit on yield in that small area. Can it recover? Very little, because you affect pollination, how many kernels you get, how big the kernels are, and we really can't recover from those. So mostly damage is done. It's determining how much damage has been done already. Soybeans, on the other hand, can muddle their way through this. We start being more worried about them in a few weeks as we get into August, and how much damage we can do to soybeans at that point.
And then, thank you. And then, which data sets does USDA to generate their soil moisture use to generate their soil moisture map? Your reply was that part of that is human assessment and part of that is monitoring, or yeah.
No, it's all human assessment. There are crop reporters that go out and then they compare the data as compared to other reports last week, last year, that sort of thing.
Now he does say soil moisture, Dennis, not
yes.
crop. Oh, okay, okay.
Yes, because that Martha showed a map that was topsoil, subsoil conditions, how they
Okay.
compare. And there, I assume that was what he was referring to. Otherwise, the other map I think Martha showed was the CPC soil moisture map, and that is called the leaky bucket model that we won't go into the model of what that is right now.
Okay, thank you. What's driving the enhanced precipitations for those areas? Those enhanced precipitation chances in those dry areas, such as southwest Iowa. Martha, I don't know if you were on the CPC call, or I'm sorry, you were?
No, I was not.
Okay, so first of all, it's difficult in the summertime to predict precipitation. A week out, 2 weeks out, a month out. So those are pretty general. And when you see that sort of light green, maybe go back to, if you will, sorry, go back to, whoop. Did you, we lost you there for a minute. Martha, are you still there? Nope.
Shoot.
Yeah, I can't pick you anymore. Anyway, those light green colors, and sort of there was 2 areas of I think for August and into the fall of enhanced probabilities for precipitation. Part of that is what the models are showing. And the models do take into account to some degree. Oh, that's good. Yeah, the models okay. The long-term models take into account how much soil moisture there is, and if there's moisture to, if you will, recycle. And so if it's been wet, there are some correlations with staying wet in the summertime, especially because you evaporate that or evapotranspirate that, and you can have more moisture and you can create more rainfall chances. This is more of dynamic modeling, so there are good indications that there will be a we call it a mesoscale convective system moving across the plains and into Iowa and northern Missouri. I think this is over a 7-day period. I think this is Sunday into Monday. Dennis or Martha, do you know? This particular
it's like day 5. It's like day 5 or so. So it's a little ways out to give a good indication of location.
Yeah. So this is taking into account all the precipitation that could fall over the next 7 days. So that could be a couple different events, but that's pretty substantial. And that usually the darker, the higher the amount is, generally correlates to a higher probability. So it's a lot more likely to happen. Now you have to these update at least every 12 hours, and so you can kind of see how this changes over time. It may shift slightly north, may shift slightly south, east or west, that kind of thing. That, if you will, that precipitation bullseye. Okay, I'm sure I didn't answer that question, but that's what triggers the probability shift to La Nina from neutral. Oh yeah, so a lot of that is ocean-derived information, and I don't know, Martha, if you want to say anything more about that. It's really the cooling of the ocean and what the models are picking up on, because there's dynamical and statistical models that are used to make these types of predictions this far out. Anything you want to say about that, Martha?
Yeah, just like ocean temperature and then winds and pressure kind of in the equatorial Pacific. And I think right now there are conditions that some that do indicate La Nina and some that don't, and they're kind of mixed in what the scale of what they're showing right now anyway. So that's why we're in a watch, and not all of these indicators that tell you it's a La Nina are in place quite yet.
And it's not all models. I mean, some of this is observed. You just look at the temperatures out there in the ocean and they're cooling, okay? And it looks like things are going, and there's some momentum. They're probably the best way to say that.
Yeah.
Is there a site that tracks heat index numbers? And I'm assuming you mean forecast heat index numbers. And can we relate those numbers to things like evaporative stress or the eddy model? I have an answer, but I kind of want to hear what Dennis has to say about the evaporative stress piece, or Martha for that matter.
They're looking for a forecast or monitored numbers.
Yeah. So the forecast, you can get those on a National Weather Service site at the local weather forecast office. I do believe that is something that is tracked on the hour. You can look at hourly amounts, and if somebody wants to write it in there and tell me, because I know there's a bunch of NOAA people on here, I'm pretty sure the heat indice is one of those things that they do out to 7 days in the future, hour by hour. And because I know the Weather Service keeps track of that and reports on it. So, Mark, you and I know each other. We can talk about this later, but I think those numbers are available. Yes. And can you relate those to things like evaporative stress or EDDI? I'm not sure on that. I'm not sure exactly if you would relate heat stress to that or not. Definitely heat stress, not evaporative stress. I don't know. I'll just put it that way. And that wraps up the questions that we have. Yes, you're welcome, Mary Baker. Thank you very much, everybody. And we will see you in a month or so. And let's hope you get rain where you need it. And let's hope it dries out where you need it. And it stays cool where you need it, which is pretty much everywhere. Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Martha. And thanks,
You're
Dennis,
welcome.
for being on here. Appreciate that very much.